TikTok, time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all over the world. I'm your friendly neighborhood philosopher, David Wood, and with me now is Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for having me on. How are you doing, David?
I'm good. Um, Now, you have sort of an interesting background. Why don't you share a little bit about? I know you have a doctor in front of your name, so why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about that?
Sure. So, just to give a rundown of my educational background, I did my bachelor's degree at University of Strathclyde in forensic biology, which is the application of scientific evidence to crime scene investigation. So, did that for 4 years, and then I fell in love with the world of molecular biology and was really struck in particular by the engineering prowess and designoid characteristics of living organisms. Was often rather baffled at how anyone could go through a 4 year university program in the natural sciences and come out an atheist at the other end, because the evidence seemed to me to be so compelling for the truth of theism. So I subsequently, following my bachelor's degree, did a master's degree in evolutionary biology to try to gain a better understanding of the evolutionary perspective. And then I interned for a year at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, helping Stephen Meyer with his book, Darwin's Doubt. And then I did a subsequent master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience, and then which was at Newcastle University. And then finally, I did a PhD studying the evolution of the eukaryotic cell cycle, the cell division cycle, which was also a university. I'm a professor of biology at a Christian school called Sattler College in Boston, Massachusetts. So I teach various biology-related courses, including freshman biology, genetics and genomics, microbiology. I teach bioethics. So that's just a little bit of my educational background. I'm also currently pursuing a master's degree at Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is in biblical studies as well. So
Two quick follow-up questions based on some stuff you just said. Now, you said you're baffled by how someone can go through, an education in the sciences and come out an atheist, but you have a doctorate in evolutionary biology. So doesn't that explain how we got to where we are? Like, how can you be thinking that there's no good atheistic explanation for this stuff when you've literally got a doctorate in the explanation?
yeah, so obviously I don't find the explanation particularly satisfying. I think that there are certain features of biological systems which are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an unguided stochastic process, such as chance and physical necessity. In terms of evolution, there are a number of real scientific challenges, I think, to the naturalistic scenario of life's origins and evolution on Earth. So, for example, I think that there's merit to Michael Behe's concept of irreducible complexity, and I think that there are many thousands of such systems in biology. And basically, an irreducibly complex system is where you have a higher level objective that's accomplished by multiple subcomponents or multiple subfunctions that have to work together in concert to achieve that higher level objective. And so any process that's capable of producing that type of system is going to have foresight in order to visualize a complex end goal and bring together everything needed to realize that end goal. So an example of an irreducibly complex system would be the DNA replication machinery, by which the cell will duplicate its DNA to prepare for cell division. And there are a number of components that are necessary for that to work. You've got the DNA polymerase that actually carries out the copying. You have the initiation proteins that open up the DNA double helix or unwind the DNA double helix. You've got the helicase that breaks the hydrogen bonds that link the bases together to allow for copying. You have the single-stranded binding proteins that bind to the single strands of DNA and prevent them from reannealing. The DNA polymerase isn't able to begin copying unless it's first primed, because it needs what's called a 3' hydroxyl group in order to copy. So you have a primase enzyme which synthesizes the short primer and so forth. That's just a very short sketch of some of the components needed. The DNA polymerase also needs to be clamped onto the strand of DNA, and it has a sliding clamp, and the sliding clamp itself has to be loaded on by a clamp loader, and so on. You have topoisomerase enzymes that alleviate the supercoiling that's induced by the torsional stress, and so on. If any of those components and many more were missing, then you wouldn't have DNA replication machinery that worked half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to, but it would be broken. And this is one of my favorite examples of irreducible complexity, because natural selection presupposes differential survival. You can't have natural selection unless you have differential survival, but differential survival requires that you have self-replicability. And so you can't really invoke natural selection to explain the origins or the emergence of self-replicability without assuming the existence of the very thing you're trying to explain. So that's just one small challenge to evolution. There's a lot more that one could say on that.
Yeah, I was just on a long car ride with Ridvan, the apostate prophet, and we ended up talking about that a little bit. And I was just pointing out that in order for evolution to even get off the ground, what you need from the beginning, as far as something that is capable of evolving. So right there from the beginning, whatever life forms, it has to be capable, one, of replicating itself. So it's not just some sort of life that forms and then eventually dies and then there's nothing else. It has to be capable of replicating itself. Two, it can't make exact copies of itself, because then you have no variation, and there's nothing for, there's no variation to act on. But three, it has to be very similar to the original in order to preserve any good traits. And so you need something very specific in order to get the entire process off the ground. And I don't know, seems pretty amazing that you get that right from the beginning. I mean, imagine like a factory or something like that, building a factory that replicates factories, and that's like the first factory, and it's capable of replicating other factories or something.
Exactly. And for molecular machines, like what I just described, what you require are multiple proteins, many different proteins that have to be very specifically crafted in order to work together to achieve this higher level objective. And so the probabilities of getting even one protein are, in my judgment, astronomically small. But the probabilities just multiply exponentially when we're requiring multiple components to work together in concert to achieve a higher level objective. Even the simplest organisms, like Mycoplasma genitalium, for example, which is a bacterial cell, which is it's an obligate parasite, and it's not free living. It can't live outside of a host, and it's one of the simplest known organisms, and yet it still requires about 300 genes, 300 different proteins. So it's the complexity of even the simplest life is just absolutely mind-boggling and way beyond what can be plausibly accounted for by a stochastic, unguided process that doesn't have a mind involved. And so, in summary, when we observe these sorts of irreducibly complex systems and information-rich systems, information processing and retrieval apparatus that we find inside the cell, these sorts of things are phenomena which are habitually associated in every realm of experience with conscious deliberation or intelligent agency. And so it's not particularly surprising, on the hypothesis that a mind was involved, that you'd find information-rich systems such that we find in biology. But it is wildly surprising on the falsity of that hypothesis. And so it tends to, in fact, strongly confirm the design hypothesis over the non-design hypothesis, which in turn lends credence to a theistic worldview.
And when normal people who don't have a science background hear protein, they're only thinking in terms of nutrition, right? Like, I need to get a certain amount of protein. There's a certain amount of protein in this food. If I'm working out, I need to get my protein. When you talk about proteins in living organisms, these are basically things that are the structures in living things that are doing all the work in terms of how would you describe it in terms of these parts? They're like little machines performing little functions, right?
Right. So enzymes are comprised of subunits called amino acids, and basically the sequential arrangement of those amino acids will determine how a protein will collapse into a three-dimensional structure, and that three-dimensional structure will determine how the protein behaves within the cell, whether it might contribute to some biochemical pathway, or it might contribute to some larger molecular machine. So that is a function of proteins in biology.
And when you talked about how improbable it is to get a protein, so amino acids arranged in a sequence, they have to be in a certain sequence in order for this to collapse into something that actually performs the relevant function. It was in Signature in the Cell. Dr. Myers described the probability of getting these proteins, and I forget what it's called, but there's you can actually calculate the maximum possible number of of particle interactions since the beginning of the universe. By you take the entire number of seconds from the beginning of the universe and you multiply that by the fastest possible interactions between particles. So you set the speed of light as an upper limit. So assume that every particle is interacting at the speed of light. And then you multiply that times the number of particles in the universe, and it's around 10 to the 80th power. And you get this number, and there you have the entire possible maximum number of particle interactions since the beginning of the universe. And when you get that number, and then you say, okay, here's the probability of getting a relevant medium length protein chain. And given the time available in the universe, you're not even close to getting one medium length protein. So the idea that you're getting the hundreds you would need for the most basic known life, all in the same place to where they can come together and form the cell, seems astronomically improbable. I'm bringing this up because human beings seem pretty good with simple probabilities, right? Like if I flip a coin, 1 and 2, we get 1 and 2. If it's rolling, some dice, we get the idea of the probability of rolling dice. Once you start getting into like your probability of winning the lottery, it's like let's say 1 in 17 million or something like that. There we're not very good at it, and that's why people keep playing. But then when you're talking about like 1 in 10 to the 10 to the this, it's just our minds aren't very good at processing these kinds of probabilities. And so we think, but there's a long time in the universe, and there's a lot of space in the universe, there's a lot of stars, and therefore it could happen. When actually, mathematically, you can calculate the probabilities, even given gigantic space and tons of particles and so on, and you're still not even close to getting what you need.
Absolutely, you're completely correct. This is what Dembski calls the universal probability bound, right? The available probabilistic resources at one's disposal. And because when you're calculating the improbability of an event, that must always be relative to the probabilistic resources at one's disposal. So, for example, an analogy I sometimes give is imagine an ATM machine. We've all used ATM machines, and let's say that you've stolen someone's bank card, but you don't know the PIN number, and you put the bank card into the ATM machine. Well, there's 10 digits on the 10-digit PIN pad, right? There's 0 to 9, and there's a 4-digit PIN number that you have to guess, and so that's equivalent to 10,000. There's 10,000 possible ways you could dial in a 4-digit number to a 10-digit PIN pad. That's 10 to the 4th power. Now, most banks will lock you out of your account after 3 failed attempts at guessing the right PIN number. And so if you only have 3 attempts, that corresponds to the probabilistic resources at one's disposal. It's overwhelmingly more likely that you're going to fail to randomly guess the correct PIN number if you're just punching in random numbers. And so that's essentially analogous to what we're dealing with when it comes to the origins of life and the evolution of life on our planet, is that universal probability bound gets swamped very, very quickly. The chances of the self-replicatability of an RNA molecule emerging in the primitive environment of the early Earth is, in my judgment, astronomically small. The getting these very specifically crafted proteins to have to work together in concert to achieve these higher level objectives, or getting an adult organism capable of reproduction from a zygote, a fertilized egg, is just way beyond what you can accomplish by chance and physical necessity. And the fossil record allows you sometimes to put a limit on how much time you have in terms of getting the A to B transitions that transpired in the history of life. So, for example, the human-chimp divergence is thought to have taken place by most evolutionary biologists about 6 million years ago. There was a paper published in 2008 in the Journal of Genetics by Rick Dewart and Dina Schmidt from Cornell University, where they basically sought to calculate, using a population genetics model, what's the waiting time that you would require to get 2-step non-adaptive mutations to in a transcription factor binding site. How long would that take, given what we know about the population size, the effective population size of hominids, which until very recently was in the 10,000 to 20,000 individuals per generation range, what we know about the generation turnover times and the average mutation rates. And they give an estimate of 216 million years for that 2-step codependent mutation. But guess what? You've only got 6 million years, according to the fossil record, for the entire transition. So that's known as the waiting time problem in evolutionary biology, which is also, I think, a formidable challenge. It's a numbers problem. And so I think that's also relevant to the universal probability bound.
One more follow up question on that, because we do want to get to we want to. We said we're going to talk about the resurrection, but given your background there, I just wanted to touch on a couple of other issues. But you've also interacted with Muslims in your discussions, and so given your background in biology, how are you not a Muslim, given the amazing scientific insights that you find in the teachings of Muhammad and in the Quran?
Yeah, and unfortunately, my own reading of the Quran reveals the Quran to be rather a scientific train wreck rather than a scientific miracle.
Wait. It's a scientific what?
It's a scientific train wreck.
Train wreck. Okay, go ahead. Just want to make sure I heard that right.
Not a scientific miracle. I've actually debated Nadir Ahmed, our old friend Nadir Ahmed, on this very topic, which is fun to watch. But yeah, I just don't find what the Quran says about modern science to be at all plausible. Stars are apparently missiles that Allah hurls at demons to strain their ears in the direction of the heavenly councils and so on. I mean, just up and down the line, the Quran just gets it wrong about science, as well as many other things, such as the historical anachronisms that we find in the Quran and the errors that the Quran makes in relation to Jesus and his crucifixion and so forth. So, I mean, the Quran is just a disaster zone as far as the evidence goes.
But haven't scientists discovered that semen is formed between the backbone and ribs?
No.
No?
I'm afraid, it's just one of the Quran's many blunders.
Yeah, it actually hasn't been pointed out enough. But when the Quran talks about the mingled fluids and so on, and then you go to the Hadith to figure out what this is talking about, that this is giving like the two semens theory that was common in the ancient world and would have been popular during the time of Muhammad and so on. And so it's just there's still awesome stuff to point out there.
Right. Muhammad also seems to have been influenced by Galen, especially his stuff on embryology, which is also a mess, I think. But it was standard for the time period in which he was writing.
Yeah, it looks like. If you take some of the teachings of Galen and still of Aristotle and Hippocrates that were circulating during the time, and you combine that with some of the common Jewish theories there that were eventually recorded in like the Talmud, and you sort of put that all together, that's the science that you get from the Muslim sources, which now you have this double problem in the sense that one, the Quran and Muhammad are getting things massively wrong, but two, they're also being plagiarized, and so it's a double error. So interesting stuff.